Thank you so much, Alan. Good morning. First of all, God bless you all. I'm so excited. What's wrong? Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm so excited to be here with you this morning. Happy Black History Month. It is my favorite time of the year. I want to, before I get started, extend Alan a tremendous thank you for reaching out to me a year ago and saying, hey, we got to get you on the calendar. Please do this. So I'm very excited to be here with you all this morning. Again, I'm Dr. Littleton. I am an independent scholar and researcher. However, I also work at the Atlanta History Center. I want to welcome you all that have not been to come visit and spend some time with us. So today, we're going to be talking about African-American neighborhoods and cemeteries in the Buckhead area. Many of us drive past these places all the time, having no idea what they used to be, what they once were. And so I'm hoping today that we learn something new about some places that are kind of old in the city. So I'm a mover and a shaker, so I'm going to move around a lot. I'm sorry. That's the professor in me that I'm going to move around to both sides. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then, of course, we'll open the floor up to questions. I'm sure you all will have some questions, and then we'll move forward from there. So, happy Black History Month. Everywhere I go in the city during the month of February, I start with these same two slides. No matter what the subject matter is, I start with these same two slides because Black History Month provides us some great opportunities. So for our clarity, I want us to know that Black History Month is not intended to be the only time that we acknowledge and celebrate African American history. I know people say that a lot. It's really intended for our collective celebration. So for those of us who are not like me that do the business of history every day, Black History Month allows us the opportunity to collectively celebrate the contributions of Black folks to the U.S., world history, and global culture. It allows us to engage with the stories of historic people, places, like we'll talk about today, and events. Atlanta, Georgia, the United States, and the global community have an abundance of Black history to be shared throughout the year, especially during the month of February. So I included this slide because every history has a historical context. And so it's important for us to understand the historical context of Black History Month that starts with Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was a historian and educator. He's often referred to as the father of Black history. He's the second African American to earn a PhD in history from Harvard University after Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. He's the founder of the Association for the Study of Negro, now African American Life and History in 1915, and he is the person who invented Negro History Week in 1926, which is now expanded to be Black History Month. I'm saying that because we are on the eve of the centennial of Black History Month, and so it's really important for us to think about the way that we have gone about studying African American history over the past almost 100 years. His most famous work is The Miseducation of the Negro, which he published in 1933, which is still an extremely relevant text. So I encourage us all to encounter that text at some point in time. Also worth noting that Black History Month, or Negro History Week, was founded in February in honor of the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and this man here, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, as we know, was an abolitionist and statesman. He also taught himself to read while he was an enslaved child, freed himself, and then authored 3 slave narratives or autobiographies. And so this is a genius man that Dr. Woodson sought to honor by creating Negro History Week. Fun fact, because it is Black History Month and I love a good fun fact here and there, Frederick Douglass is the most photographed American of the 19th century. Not the most photographed Black American, but the most photographed American. There are more photos of Frederick Douglass than anyone else during the 19th century. He was very ahead of his time in capturing himself photographically, so you can actually see him age throughout the years. So from from right when he was emancipated around 27 years old. You see his progression. He was very intentional about photography and the types of stories that photographs can tell about a person or a community. There's a text called Picturing Frederick Douglass that I encourage you to pick up that is full of all of the images of Frederick Douglass. It was actually edited by his family members. So Frederick Douglass, as I said, authored 3 narratives. My favorite, a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, along with The Miseducation of the Negro, are my book recommendations for Black History Month. So if you're looking for anything to read this month, I definitely encourage you to encounter both of those texts. So, we are here to talk about African American cemeteries as a repository for Black history. And I know that's interesting because a lot of the time when we think about cemeteries, we definitely think about them as sacred spaces, right? So we think of them as final resting places. But as a public historian, I often think about cemeteries as historic sites. Like, what can we gain from these places? Now, there are several communities that have cemeteries in Buckhead. What people don't know is that Buckhead over the years has transformed into a very wealthy and luxurious location in the city of Atlanta. But most folks don't know that there was actually a really large population of African Americans that lived in this area. And we know that from the number of burials that are in this area, many of them dating back to the 19th century. So there are communities like Bagley Park, which some of us know, like Johnsontown, which we've heard of, Piney Grove, which some of us know, Willistown, Savagetown, and Happy Hill. These are all different neighborhoods that used to constitute this entire area that no longer exist. What we know is that these cemeteries allow us to talk about the history of these communities, as well as reveal some of the frustrating parts of Atlanta's history that we have to grapple with contemporarily. So when we look at these cemeteries, what we're doing is not only looking at them as repositories of Black history, but also they allow us to tell the story of the city that we live in and how it has evolved to where it is in the present day. So, cemeteries as historic sites offer us the opportunity to not only take a look at the cultural traditions of a community and people, but I want us to encourage us to think about burial practices in general. Human beings are the only species that bury the deceased. We are the only ones that ritualize the burial of the deceased, right? So we know we get together and we sit down and say, when I pass, these are the things that I want to happen. These are my arrangements. We make a plan for that. We are the only species that does that. Now, that's not to say that other species don't feel the loss and grief of death. It is to say that human beings, going all the way back to the ancient world, when we think about the Egyptians, right, and mummification process, or any other ancient society, what we see is the ritualizing and burying of the dead, and that it also always has some type of human and cultural significance, right? So we're familiar with the Second Line in New Orleans, right? Where we see that parade. That's the culture of the space. So they bury folks differently depending on where you are and what place you have to be buried. So the nature of how a person is buried depends on multiple factors, which include access to resources, again, place and space. Those are key things when we're talking about burials. Again, a very unique human practice. Cemeteries in general tell us stories about communities, neighborhoods, and generations of families. So they become a great tool for genealogy, particularly for communities that have not been able to keep their history written down. The cemetery allows that place for the repository of family and cultural and community history. African American cemeteries specifically are an interesting place because in several instances, they have not been kept up because of racist practices. We have to be totally honest about that. We'll talk about that a little bit more soon, as well as lack of resources, time, and displacement. African American cemeteries often go uncared for and become what we call in the field of history a forgotten cemetery, right? A place that we know folks exist, but a place that does not have that long-term care that we need. So African American cemeteries can tell us a lot about the history of communities, particularly in the Buckhead area. So African American cemeteries have some really specific characteristics that we should look at, particularly those that date back to the 19th century. Again, going back to that idea of resources, there was a time in America where African Americans did not have any financial resources, right? So a lot of these burials were without a formalized coffin or burial space. They would have wrapped them in a cloth and put them down into the ground, which means that the decomposition process would have taken place very quickly. So a lot of the times in these 19th century cemeteries, there are no remains there. There may be some teeth, some hair, some nails, but you won't see actual remains because of the acidity of the red clay, specifically in places like Georgia. In many cases, burials are unmarked, but have natural markers. So in some African American cemeteries, you'll see a family plot that's marked by now a humongous tree. The tree will have been there hundreds of years. You'll also see shrubbery and bushes and flowers and some types of natural markings, not always a formalized headstone. In some cases, you'll see what we call a field stone, which is about a rock about this size, that they just placed down. If you didn't know a burial was there, you might step right over it thinking that it's just a large rock and not an actual marker of a burial site, which we'll talk about in a minute. There are also instances where these burials are marked with personal items. A shard of pottery, a shard of glass, a bracelet, a handkerchief. There's also several times that we find beads and other materials in these cemeteries that signify them as a burial, again, though they may not have an actual stone marker. The number of African American cemeteries signifies that there was once a multiple thriving African American communities. I'm saying communities plural and not one community for a minute, and I'm going to tell you why. And that these communities are a significant aspect of Atlanta's history. A lot of the time we'll talk about places like Auburn Avenue. We've all heard of Auburn Avenue, right? We've heard of Southview Cemetery or Oakland Cemetery, which shout out to them. I have friends that do great work in those locations, but sometimes we don't talk about these smaller cemeteries that are equally as significant to the city's history. I'm hoping that our time together will allow us to make sure that some very important spaces in Atlanta's Black history are not forgotten. I want to encourage you to drive past some of these spaces, which is why I've included addresses and locations, just so you can ride through and check that out. And of course, there are ongoing preservation and restoration projects. So if you want to get on board with one of these projects, I can definitely connect you to some folks that are doing some really great work with these locations. So this is where my journey as a cemetery nerd begins. This is how I became, as my friends call me, the Black Wednesday Addams. My journey begins, interestingly, not in Atlanta, Georgia. Well, kind of in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm originally from Denver, Colorado. My grandmother is from Bennettsville, South Carolina. So I grew up hearing stories about the South and burial practices and burial traditions. But again, I'm from Denver, Colorado, much colder environment, a much different space. And so I moved to Atlanta about 15 years ago to pursue graduate studies at Clark Atlanta University. And when I started my dissertation project, my dissertation advisor said to me, okay, well, if you are going to be, at the time I was studying Gabriel's Rebellion, which took place in 1800 Richmond, Virginia, he said, you have to go to the Library of Virginia and see what materials they have there. So I took a trip to the Library of Virginia, and I spent 3 days running around like a chicken with my head cut off. I only had 3 days. I'm a graduate student, y'all, so I had like $2 for the entire trip, and it was a one-time thing, so I had to get in and get out. So I ran all around the Library of Virginia for 3 days until a librarian stopped me and said, "Who are you?" And I thought that was such a peculiar question, because I'm like, Lenise Littleton, researcher? And she's like, no one ever comes and looks at the papers that you're looking at. Like, what are you doing? Tell me what you're doing. So I told her about my dissertation project. I said, I'm trying to prove that literacy was impactful on uprisings led by enslaved people. I'm starting in 1800 because I found out that all the slave codes changed after this moment in Richmond in 1800. So I'm here to look at the court documents and all the papers to get it done. And she said, "Oh, well, that's great." Now, my juice is a librarian. She's like, "Oh, that's wonderful. You're in the wrong place." I said, "Ma'am, what? I had to crowdfund to get all the way up here, and I've been here for 3 days." And she said, "No, you need to go on the slave trail. You cannot understand what you're talking about unless you go out into the elements and have this experience on this slave trail." It's about 2.5 mile walk. So I took one of my colleagues who was terrified because it's out on the water. And she's like, "Girl, I'm not going down there." And I'm like, "We have to go. We have to look." So we go on the slave trail and we walk it for 2.5 miles. It was a very moving experience because it's not a wide trail, and it is the actual trail that they would have offloaded Africans off of the ships and walked them the 2.5 miles to this jail called Lumpkin Slave Jail. So we walk the trail for 2.5 miles, and we end at the historic burial ground. And I'm like, I'm good. As you can see, it's at the end of a tunnel. And I lightened the picture, but it was kind of dark. And my friend was like, "I'm not going down this tunnel with you." And I'm like, "We got to." So we link arms and we go. And what we find is a historic African-American burial ground that contained the remains of several enslaved persons who worked and labored and built families in Richmond, Virginia, including General Gabriel, who was executed for organizing this rebellion. So in going there and standing there, I got a much better understanding of the African-American community of Richmond and how they were committed to the preservation of their history and storytelling and preserving this burial ground for one of their heroes, or for many of their heroes. So that's where the story starts, at Richmond, Virginia, this photo here on the left-hand side. So I completed the dissertation. I thought I was done with that. I got this postdoc at Clemson University where I was working with a very, very talented scholar, Dr. Rhonda Thomas, on the Call My Name project. Very excited. The day before I start my postdoc, Dr. Thomas calls me and says, "Hey, we've got some really interesting activity happening in the campus cemetery, and so we're going to expand your postdoc a little bit to see what's going on." Now, again, I have no idea that this is why I'm going there. I'm thinking that I'm going there to study the enslaved population that was at the Fort Hill Plantation, which is now Clemson University. And what we end up finding out is that we recovered 667 unmarked burials of enslaved persons, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, domestics, convict laborers who built Clemson University from 1897 to 1915, and their descendants all over the formerly established campus cemetery. Many of these burials were underneath a paved road. Many of these burials were underneath the burials of white faculty and staff who had been burying there for well over 100 years. Many of them, we believe, were disturbed and destroyed in the construction of the stadium that sits right behind the cemetery. So for 2 years, I was there giving tours and interacting with community members about their history, trying to gather any community-based knowledge that we could about this space as a burial ground. And what we found out is that there's actually no way for 667 burials to be forgotten or unknown. So once we got out into the community space, we started to hear these stories about how the community had tried to push back against the university university expansion and had basically been bulldozed, like literally to the point where their burials were unmarked. Many of them have been marked by those field stones that I told you about. They unmarked them and went on with creating a cemetery space for the burial of notable white faculty and staff. So Clemson is an interesting place because not only are these 667 unmarked graves, which are now marked by small flags, but there are about 600 beautiful, ornate headstones that mark the graves of white faculty and staff and their families there. So we begin to see again that idea of racism playing out in the cemetery space. So after I left Clemson, I returned back to Atlanta when I got my position at the Atlanta History Center. And what happened? My pastor, David F. Richards III, is what happened. I'm sure you all know him. If you've not met him, you will encounter him. He is quite a character. Before I went to Clemson, he prayed over me and he said, "All right, Littleton, you need to come home and help us figure out what's going on in our cemetery." I've been attending New Hope. And I said to him, "Hey, I'm just a historian. I'm not a cemetery person. I don't have knowledge." And he told me, "Well, God is going to work it out to equip you with what we need." And I said, "Okay." Shout out to God. He always works it out. So I'm like, okay, great. So I ended up returning back to Atlanta. And that brings me to New Hope AME, one of the last surviving African-American neighborhoods or communities in Buckhead, of which I am a very proud member. So New Hope has a very unique story. It's right down the street from here on Arden Road, and it was established in 1869. So I want us to look at that 1869 date because that is just 4 years after the end of the Civil War. Now, we're all somewhat familiar with Georgia's history, right? We know that Sherman came through here and did something. We were probably all taught that Sherman came through and burned down all of Atlanta. Not the truth. General Sherman came and burned down the major railroad systems. Atlanta was a main source of economics and transportation. And so the way to stop the Confederacy was to shut down the train line. So when we say that Sherman came through and marched to the sea, what he actually did is dismantled the economic system and transportation system and left much of the city intact. So 4 years following the Civil War, we see in 1869, a very prominent, wealthy landowner in this area by the name of James Whispering Smith. In 1869, he deeded 2 acres of his property to his formerly enslaved persons for the creation of a church and a school. That church and school is now New Hope. What's interesting is that oral history suggests that the community at New Hope existed long before the formal founding of the church. There's an event called, it's a very large spiritual gathering known as camp meeting. We are sure that camp meeting had been held in the area long before the formal establishment of the church. Camp meeting was a spiritual gathering for both enslaved and free African Americans, as well as some whites that would come and worship independently in that space. So we know that there was already a connection to where New Hope is actually founded right now. This is the original foundation of the church. This is the original church. We've been through a lot, but we're still here. It's probably hot in there. It's always hot in there. But we are in this original location. The schoolhouse was located where the parking lot currently is. And New Hope is an amazing place because we have generations of families that go back to the founding of the church. So it's really an amazing thing to hear the stories that have been passed down about not only New Hope, but about how the area has developed around New Hope. So when I talk to some members of New Hope, they'll tell me, "I remember when Buckhead was the countryest place in Atlanta. It was hogs, it was chickens, there was all this luxury boutiques and all of that." That is a very 21st century Buckhead. It's not the Buckhead of the past. So we know that folks were celebrating camp meeting in this area, and we still celebrate every year, every August we celebrate. We have a homecoming celebration. We pull the tent out and folks come home and we tell those stories about how New Hope continues to be the hub of one community of African Americans in Buckhead. There he goes. That's my pastor, y'all. David F. Richards III, who is on a mission to preserve and restore not only the history of New Hope, but the cemetery. So New Hope is home to over 700 burials of African Americans dating back to the 1870s. So directly across the street from the church, you'll see this lovely cemetery that actually slopes down. When Pastor Richards said to me in 2019, Littleton, you need to figure out the cemetery, the brush was probably up to where his waist is. You couldn't see any of the burials. So when he said, fix the cemetery, I was like, what? How? Where? I can't even see it. So we began a cleanup project, and from the cleanup, what we began to see was all of these types of field stones here. So when you clean up a cemetery, you can't just go in with a weed whacker, because you might end up chopping off something very unique. So in a lot of instances, like one I'll tell you in a minute, some folks have to bring goats in to kind of chomp down some of that brush, eat some of that up before we get in there to begin to thoroughly clean it out. So New Hope initiated a cleanup project during COVID, and it was very successful. After the cleanup, ground penetrating radar was done that showed us that there were almost 700 burials. Again, this is not 700 marked burials. We have several that are unmarked. Now, here's where it gets sticky. According to oral traditions and stories told by senior members, there are burials of enslaved persons behind the church. In the oral histories, they say there's slave graves. So there was a very senior member of the church who told us he died when he was about 90 years old. But a couple months before he passed away, he told us a story about being told, you better watch out. If you're being bad, the slaves will get up from behind the church and come get you. That was a thing that was always said, but it was only known that there was a formalized cemetery across the street from the church. So this man here made me put on my cemetery boots and took me out last December into the brush behind the church, where we identified several depressions in the land that signaled to me that there is some type of activity, as we would say, going on behind there. We are pretty sure that there are several burials of enslaved persons behind the church and possibly under the church. We're not sure. There will be no way for us to know if they were under the church, because that land was disturbed and destroyed to lay the foundation of what is now the church. But we are currently trying to figure out exactly how many burials are behind the church. And we are almost sure that there are several, which also makes New Hope a phenomenal historic site, is that we have retained several of the obituaries of folks that have passed away going back at least 100 years. So we do have some type of written documentation for individuals who were buried in the space, even if they do not have a formal headstone. That's rare. I've not seen that in a lot of instances. So New Hope is a very, very, very blessed place. What I do want to say is that New Hope is maintained by the congregation and friends like you all, like Alan, who I met last year. So it's very important that a community effort exists beyond the African American community that is housed in New Hope in the surrounding area. We can't do it unless it's a collective effort. So that's why I'm saying that history allows us an opportunity to collectively engage in the preservation of African American history and stories that are really all of our history. Next, one of my favorite locations, this is an awesome story. Bagley Park, also known as Macedonia Park, was a thriving community in what is now the Buckhead area. During the 1870s, a community of formerly enslaved African Americans settled in the area that is now present-day Far Road, not far from here. But in 1912, they expanded significantly because of a terrifying event that happened in Forsyth County, just about 40 minutes away from Atlanta. So in 1912, there was a thriving community of African Americans living in Forsyth County, about 1,500 of them. Many of them were the descendants of individuals who were enslaved in that area. And they began to make substantial progress until in 1912, there was a white woman named May Crow who was sexually assaulted and died from the injuries that she sustained during the assault. White citizens of Forsyth immediately pointed fingers at the largest black man in the community, a man named Robert Edwards. He was very large, very tall, very muscular. And they accused him of raping and murdering May Crow. They arrested him. They held him in the county jail. Then a lynch mob came and snatched him out of the jail, shot him, tied him to the back of a wagon, and then strung him up in the center of the middle of Forsyth County. They left him there for days with a sign on his body that said, "Do not wake." After that, they initiated a campaign of racial terrorism and lynched 2 teenagers. Oscar Daniel and Ernest Knox were also lynched just a month after Robert Edwards. So they lynched Robert in September, and then the 2 teenagers who were his girlfriend's little brother and cousin just a month later. Following these lynchings, white citizens of Forsyth went on a campaign of racial terrorism, assaulting all of the black residents in Forsyth and telling them that they had 24 hours to leave or they would be killed. There are stories of bundles of sticks being left on their porches, being left with a sign that says, "Next time it'll be dynamite, get out of here." By January, again, these lynchings took place in September and October. By January of 1913, there were 0 black residents in Forsyth County. They fled to surrounding areas. Many of them came to what is now Buckhead. They settled about 40 miles away from that trauma. William Bagley was a prominent landowner in Forsyth County. After the campaign of racial violence that had been initiated by Forsyth's white residents, Bagley was forced to abandon his land and relocated to what is now Far Road in Buckhead. He was so beloved by his community that they informally called it Bagley Park, but the city formally called it Macedonia Park. Bagley was very, very, very significant to this community. And when he died in 1939, he was buried in Mount Olive Cemetery. This is actually a photo that I took last year at the dedication of Mount Olive Cemetery. So Mount Olive is a much smaller plot of land. You would miss it if you didn't know that it was there. You've probably driven past it 100 times, not knowing that at one point it was a thriving community. At its height, there were nearly 400 families living in Bagley Park neighborhoods. There was a substantial amount of African Americans that lived there. Many of them worked in domestic roles in the homes of white Atlanta. would say at least half of us. Yes, I got to get to church too. Thank y'all so much.